What if death isn't the end in the ICU, just the beginning? You think hospitals are safe? The ICU is where reality splits. A realm where monitors scream, ventilators hiss, and the dying whisper back. Nurses here don't just save lives, they duel with shadows. Ever seen a corpse sit up and smile? Heard a patient predict their death to the second? Felt a hand on your shoulder in an empty room? This isn't stress. These are bone-deep truths from nurses who've witnessed. Ghosts coding patients before their hearts stop. Voices chanting names of staff who died decades ago. Cold spots that cling like hands around your throat. Still trust your stethoscope? Press play. The ICU's darkest secrets don't stay on the charts. The dead don't leave. They wait for the next shift. My name is Ana Rivera, and I've been an ICU nurse at Mercy General Hospital in Halifax for 7 years. This place is a fortress of life and loss. Its corridors stretching long and narrow, lined with peeling green walls and flickering lamps that cast jagged shadows across the tiled floor. Portraits of stern doctors from the 1950s hang crookedly, their eyes seeming to follow me through the dimness. The air hums with the steady beep of monitors, the wheeze of ventilators, and the faint, ever-present scent of antiseptic mixed with something metallic, a reminder of the fragility we guard. I thrive in the chaos, my hands steady on 4 lines, my voice calm for panicked families. But last winter, something crept into Mercy General's ICU, a shadow that turned routine into dread, and I've never been the same. It started with Mr. Harold Grayson, an 89-year-old widower admitted with congestive heart failure. He was frail, his skin papery, his breaths shallow beneath the oxygen mask. I'd check his vitals twice hourly, my footsteps echoing in the quiet of bed 9. One night, as I adjusted his monitor, I heard it, a faint thud, rhythmic and steady, like a heartbeat but deeper, slower, coming from beneath the floor. I froze, listening. The monitor beeped normally, but the thud persisted, a pulse I couldn't place. I knelt, pressing my ear to the cold tile, and felt a chill seep through, sharp, biting, like ice cracking underfoot. No machinery, no pipes, just that relentless beat, growing louder as I lingered. I stood, shaking it off as exhaustion, but the chill stayed, clinging to my legs like damp cloth. Days later, the thud returned, always in bed 9, always at night. It coincided with Mr. Grayson's spikes in blood pressure, sudden, unexplainable surges that left him gasping, his eyes darting wildly. I mentioned it to Dr. Sarah O'Connor, my sharp-tongued attending, over morning rounds. "You're hearing things, Anna," she said, her clipboard snapping shut. Overworked brains play tricks. But I wasn't imagining it. The next shift, as I charted at the nurse's station, its ancient wood scarred, its lamp buzzing like a dying fly. The thud echoed louder, now accompanied by a shadow in the corner of my eye. I turned, expecting a colleague, but saw only the dim corridor stretching away, the lamps casting long, quivering shapes on the walls. One stormy night, the thud became a roar, shaking the floor as Mr. Grayson's monitors screamed. I rushed in, my hands flying over his chest, shouting for help as his pulse raced. In the chaos, I saw it. A silhouette behind the bed, tall and hunched, its outline blurred but distinct. It wore a doctor's coat, tattered and stained, its back to me. I blinked, and it vanished, but the chill was palpable, wrapping around me like a shroud. Mr. Grayson stabilized, but his eyes were wide, darting to the corner where the figure had stood. "He's here," he rasped, his voice cracking. "The man who failed me." I checked his chart, no record of a male doctor involved in his care, just female nurses and Dr. O'Connor. Haunted, I dove into Mercy General's archives, a damp basement cluttered with crumbling files. After hours, I found a 1962 report. A cardiac surgeon, Dr. Harold Finch, collapsed mid-surgery in bed 9, dying of a heart attack while his patient bled out. The patient, another Harold, Harold Grayson, a distant cousin, died too, their deaths shrouded in scandal. The hospital hushed it up, sealing the wing's history. I showed the article to Nurse Priya Patel, a veteran with a skeptical streak. Her face tightened. "I've felt it too," she admitted, voice low. "A cold spot, footsteps when no one's there. Bed 9's always been off." The shadow grew bolder. Objects shifted, charts sliding off desks, a pen rolling across the floor unprompted. Patients in nearby beds reported dreams of a man in a white coat, his face blurred, whispering, "Not yet, not yet." I stayed late, watching Bed 9, when the thud became a scream, a guttural wail from beneath the floor. The shadow appeared, its face forming, Dr. Finch, eyes hollow, skin gray as ash. "You're failing them too," he hissed, his voice echoing off the walls. I stumbled back, knocking over a tray of instruments. Dr. O'Connor found me there, trembling, and ordered me to take a week off. But the shadow followed, flickering in my apartment mirror, whispering in my sleep. One night, it appeared at my window, its coat fluttering like smoke. "Find the truth," it rasped, then vanished. Back at Mercy, I begged Priya to help. We pried up a loose tile in Bed 9, revealing a hidden compartment, old surgical tools, blood-streaked and rusted, and a journal. Dr. Finch's handwriting detailed his guilt. He'd ignored warning signs, killed Harold Grayson, and died cursing the hospital. "They'll never rest," he wrote. That night, the thud roared, shaking the ICU. Dr. Finch materialized, his hands reaching for Mr. Grayson's frail form. I shouted, "We know. We'll fix it." The shadow paused, its face twisting into something like gratitude, then dissolved into ash. The thud quieted, the air warming. Mr. Grayson recovered, discharged weeks later. Bed 9 felt lighter, the chill gone, but I still hear the thud on quiet nights, faint, distant, like a heartbeat refusing to fade. I keep Finch's journal locked away, a reminder of lives lost and a hospital that never forgets. Sometimes, in the corridor's dim light, I see his shadow, a fleeting shape, watching, waiting for the next soul to fail. I've been an ICU nurse for nearly a decade, long enough to know that every hospital has its ghosts, stories whispered over stale coffee during night shifts, tales of flickering lights or footsteps in empty halls. I never put much stock in them. I deal in vitals and drips, not rumors. Dr. Lena, the attending physician who trained me when I started, was even more skeptical. "Facts over folklore," she'd say, her voice sharp as a scalpel, cutting through any hint of superstition. But that was before the wheelchair started following us, or maybe just me, through the shadowed corridors of our unit. Now, I'm not so sure where the line between fact and something else lies. It began on a quiet shift, sometime past midnight. The ICU was still, the usual chaos of alarms and rushing feet replaced by a heavy silence, broken only by the hiss of ventilators and the soft beep of monitors. I was at the nurse's station, updating charts under the flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb, when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic creak. It sounded like wheels rolling over linoleum, slow, deliberate, the kind of sound a wheelchair makes when it's pushed with care. I glanced up, expecting to see an orderly moving equipment or a patient being transferred, but the hallway was empty. Just muted green walls and long shadows stretching toward the far end of the unit. I shrugged it off, hospitals are full of noises, and went back to my work. But the creaking didn't stop. It trailed me as I made my rounds, a steady echo just behind my footsteps. I'd check a patient's for in room 302, and there it was, faint but persistent, rolling along the corridor. I'd pause by room 306 to adjust a ventilator, and it'd creep closer, then fade when I turned to look. Always shadows, nothing more. I told myself it was the building settling, or maybe pipes groaning in the walls. Old hospitals like ours are full of quirks. Still, my skin prickled every time it started up. I mentioned it to Dr. Lena a few nights later, half joking over a shared pot of coffee. "You hear anything weird out there lately? Like wheels creaking?" She raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into that dry smirk she always wore when she thought I was being dramatic. "You're imagining things, Sarah. Too many doubles. Get some sleep." I laughed it off, but the sound stuck with me, and soon, it wasn't just me hearing it. One night, the creaking led me somewhere specific. I was restocking bandages at the station when it started again, louder this time, rolling down the hall like it had a purpose. I followed it, not sure why, maybe just tired of wondering, past the rows of rooms, the sound growing sharper with each step. It stopped outside room 309, a small, rarely used space at the end of the unit. The door was ajar, the interior dark. I pushed it open, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, and there it was. An old wheelchair, rusted at the joints, sitting dead center in the empty room. No patient, no chart, no reason for it to be there. The air turned cold, gripping my chest, and the creaking stopped. Then a whisper, soft, barely audible, like a breath against my ear, "Stay." I bolted. My sneakers squeaked on the floor as I ran back to the station, heart pounding, the whisper echoing in my head. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I wasn't ready to sound like the crazy one. Instead, I buried myself in work, avoiding room 309 like it was cursed. But the next shift, I couldn't ignore it. The wheelchair was gone, vanished, no sign of it in the room or the storage closet where we keep spares. I asked the night orderly Mike if he'd moved it. He frowned, scratching his head. "What chair? I haven't been down that way all week." My stomach sank. And yet, as I walked the halls later, the creaking shadowed me again, a plea I couldn't shake. I had to know more. After my shift, I slipped into the hospital's records room, a dusty basement corner stacked with yellowing files. I dug through old logs, my hands trembling as I flipped pages. It took hours, but I found it. A patient named Evelyn Carter, admitted in 1998. Wheelchair-bound after a stroke, she'd spent her last weeks in room 309. The notes were sparse: clinical, respiratory failure, time of death 2:47 a.m., but one line stood out, scribbled by a nurse. Patient repeatedly begged staff not to leave her alone. I sat back, the file heavy in my lap. Evelyn had died there, terrified of being abandoned. Was that her voice? Her wheels? I told Dr. Lena the next day, expecting her to scoff. She didn't. Her face tightened, and she admitted she'd heard the creaking too, faint, persistent, trailing her on rounds. "I thought it was nothing," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "But last night, it woke me in the call room. I swore something rolled past the door. That shook me." Lena, the queen of facts, was rattled. This wasn't just in my head. Things escalated after that. One stormy night, the power flickered, plunging the ICU into a dim hum of backup generators. I was checking on a patient in room 304 when the creaking started, louder, frantic, rolling up and down the hall. Alarms blipped as patients stirred, restless. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and saw it. A shadow at the end of the corridor, hunched in what looked like a wheelchair, wheels glinting faintly in the dark. "Stay," it whispered, louder this time, desperate. I froze, my beam trembling over empty air as the shape dissolved. The lights surged back, and it was gone, but the creaking lingered, a low wail in the walls. It wasn't just me or Lena anymore. Patients started talking. Mrs. Hayes in room 307, recovering from surgery, grabbed my hand one morning. "She was here," she rasped, eyes wide, rolling around my bed, asking me to stay. Mr. Patel in room 310 complained of a creaky old lady watching him sleep. I jotted it all in a notebook I kept tucked in my scrubs, not for the charts, just for me. The pattern was clear. Room 309, the creaking, that single word, stay. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until the unit was quiet, then slipped into room 309 with a flashlight and a recorder, some half-baked idea of capturing proof. The room was empty, the air thick and cold. I set the recorder on the windowsill and spoke, my voice shaky. "Evelyn, if that's you, I'm here. What do you want? Silence. Then a creak, slow, deliberate, rolled from the corner. My flashlight caught nothing, but the recorder picked it up. A faint, trembling voice, layered under static. Don't leave me. I played it back 5 times, chills racing through me. I hadn't imagined it. I showed Lena the recording the next shift. Her face went pale, her usual composure cracking. This isn't possible, she muttered, but she didn't argue when I suggested we try something crazy, a vigil. We sat in room 309 after hours, lights off, the recorder running. The creaking started at 2:47 a.m., Evelyn's time of death, growing louder, circling us. Stay, the whisper came, sharp and close. Lena gripped my arm, her breath ragged. Then, a gust of cold air, and silence. When we checked the recorder, it was blank. No static, no voice, just dead air. The wheelchair never reappeared, but the creaking follows me still, fainter now, less insistent. Lena hears it too, though she won't admit it unless pressed. I stopped avoiding room 309. Instead, I linger there sometimes, talking to the empty space. I'm here, Evelyn, I'll say, hoping it's enough. The patients don't mention her as much anymore, but I feel her, a presence tied to this place, to me, to every shift where I fight to keep people from slipping away. In the ICU, you learn to live with echoes, of lives lost, of machines that fail, of pleas you can't always answer. Evelyn's one of mine now. The creaking's her voice, her wheels rolling through time, asking for what she never got, someone to stay. And I do night after night, because it's all I can give her. I've always been a creature of habit. Night shifts in the ICU at St. Agnes are my sanctuary, a controlled chaos of charts, vitals, and the steady hum of machines. The greenish glow of the monitors bathes everything in a surreal light, and there's a rhythm to it all. Check the drips, adjust the ventilators, document every detail. It's predictable, and that's where I find my calm. Or at least I used to. It started a few weeks ago, on a quiet Tuesday night. I was in room 312, tending to Mrs. Edith Harper, an elderly woman who'd been with us for days, her breaths shallow and mechanical through the ventilator. The room was dim, shadows stretching across the tiled floor, and I was focused, adjusting the settings, noting her oxygen saturation. Then I saw it, a flicker in the bedside monitor's reflection. It wasn't my face staring back. It was a man's, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his skin pale as death. His gaze locked onto mine, sharp and unyielding. My heart lurched. I spun around, expecting someone behind me, a doctor, a janitor, anyone, but the room was still. Just Mrs. Harper, unconscious and fragile, her chest rising and falling with the machine's rhythm. The door was closed, the hallway beyond silent. I turned back to the monitor, my pulse hammering in my ears, but the reflection was mine again, wide-eyed, flushed, but me. I chalked it up to fatigue. Night shifts play tricks on you, and the ICU's dim lighting doesn't help. I finished my tasks quickly, avoiding the screen, and left the room with a chill I couldn't shake. The next night, it happened again. I was checking Mrs. Harper's 4, my fingers steady on the line, when the reflection shifted. There he was, the same man, his features sharper now, lips moving silently as if forming words I couldn't hear. I froze, my breath catching. Don't look, I told myself, but curiosity tugged at me. I glanced again. His eyes were desperate, pleading. I jerked my head away, focusing on the 4 bag, the drip rate, anything real. When I peeked back, it was just me, staring with a frown I didn't recognize. I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? I saw a face in the monitor that wasn't there. They'd think I was losing it. Stress, exhaustion, the usual excuses. So I kept it quiet, but it gnawed at me. Each shift he appeared, always in room 312, always in that same monitor. His gaze grew heavier, more insistent, like he was trying to pull me into whatever limbo he occupied. I started dreading that room, but I couldn't abandon Mrs. Harper. She needed me. One night, I broke. I was alone in the break room, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I confided in Jake, the respiratory therapist who'd become my sounding board over the years. "Have you ever seen something weird in the monitors?" I asked, my voice low. "Like a face that doesn't belong?" He raised an eyebrow over his mug. "What, like a reflection from the hall?" I shook my head. "No, like someone who isn't in the room." He laughed, a soft, kind sound, and said, "Claire, you need a vacation. You're seeing ghosts." I forced a smile, but his dismissal stung. I felt more isolated than ever. The reflections didn't stop. They got worse. One night, I swore I saw the man's hand reach out, skeletal fingers brushing the inside of the screen. I gasped, dropping my pen, and it clattered under the bed. Kneeling to grab it, I felt a cold draft from the vent, like a whisper against my skin. I stood, avoiding the monitor, and focused on Mrs. Harper. Her eyelids twitched, but she didn't wake. I wondered if she saw him too, in whatever dreams she had left. I couldn't let it go. After a shift, I pored over Mrs. Harper's chart, hunting for a clue, any mention of a male relative or visitor who might match the face. Nothing. She was a widow, no kids, just a distant niece who rarely showed. I checked visitor logs, too, empty. Whoever he was, he didn't belong here. But he kept coming, night after night, his silent pleas growing frantic. The ICU, once my refuge, felt oppressive, the air thick with something I couldn't name. Then came the whispers. Not from the reflection, but from the unit itself. I'd hear soft footsteps behind me in the halls, only to turn and find them empty. Charts I'd left on the desk would shift slightly, as if brushed by an unseen hand. One night, a call light buzzed from room 310, a patient too weak to move, yet when I checked, he was asleep, the button untouched. I started keeping a notebook in my locker, jotting down every oddity. It was my way of staying sane, of proving I wasn't imagining it. Curiosity won out eventually. One quiet evening, as I adjusted Mrs. Harper's pillows, the reflection's lips moved again, more urgently. I leaned close to the monitor, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" The room went still, the hum of the ventilator deafening. Then Mrs. Harper jolted awake, her eyes glassy and wild. "He's waiting," she rasped, her voice brittle as old paper. I stumbled back, nearly toppling the four-stand. "Who's waiting?" I asked, but she sank back into stillness, her breathing uneven. My hands shook as I checked her pulse, fast but steady. I wrote it down, omitting the reflection. No one would believe me anyway. Days later, Mrs. Harper passed. It was gentle, her breaths slowed, then stopped, the monitor flatlining with a soft beep. I held her hand, whispering that it was okay to go, but I felt watched, the air heavy with sorrow not my own. After the pronouncement, I cleaned the room, stripping the bed, wiping surfaces, bracing myself for the monitor. When I looked, it was empty, just readouts and numbers. Relief hit me, but as I turned to leave, a shadow flickered in the doorway's faint light, tall, thin, too familiar. I didn't look back. I walked to the nurse's station, the weight of unseen eyes trailing me through the silent halls. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. The next night, in room 315 with a new patient, a middle-aged man post-surgery, I caught the flicker again. The same gaunt face, staring from the monitor. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about Mrs. Harper. He was following me. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back, the reflection was mine, pale and shaken. The strange occurrences multiplied. A patient in room 308 muttered about a sad man, by his bed, though he was barely conscious. The power surged one stormy night, every monitor flashing the man's face, clear, anguished, his mouth moving, for a split second before normalizing. I knocked over my chair, scrambling back, my heart racing. He wasn't tied to one room or one patient. He was reaching for me. I had to know more. After a shift, I slipped into the hospital's basement archives, a cramped room of dusty files. I searched for hours, hunting for a patient or staff member who matched the face. Finally, I found Harold Green, a man who died in room 312 years ago, alone after a car accident, his family delayed by a storm. The notes described his distress, his pleas for someone to stay. The physical description fit: gaunt, hollow-eyed, desperate. It clicked. Harold had died where Mrs. Harper had been. Maybe he'd latched onto her, or me, searching for closure. But why follow me to other rooms? I kept working, watching the monitors warily, but the answer came in the chapel. One night, exhausted, I stepped inside the small room, its stained glass window casting faint colors. I sat and whispered, "Harold, if it's you, I'm listening." A rustle, a shadow in the candlelight, tall, familiar. "I'm sorry you were alone," I said. "You're not anymore." The shadow faded, leaving a quiet warmth. The reflections stopped after that. The unit felt lighter, the oddities ceased. But last week, in room 318, I saw a new flicker, a woman's face, wide-eyed and searching. I haven't said a word. Some mysteries, I've learned, don't need solving, they just need someone to see.